So I am Tim Green, I'm the features editor of the MEF, and I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion today. Just briefly on PSD2, I'm sure that most of you watching will be aware of this legislation, which is now live, came into force this weekend. And broadly, the aim of PSD2 is to open up the payment space across the European Economic Area to more competition. It's obviously a response to the fact that the commerce is going digital, and we're going to try and make it easier for startups and incumbents to bring new ideas into that space. So the question is, how will it do this? And the answer is really through APIs. So that will compel banks across Europe to open up access to bank and transactional data to any third party that has permission from an individual. So most people think that this will lead to the creation of two different kinds of third-party providers. The first ones are the payment intermediary service providers, that's PISPS, and warning there will be quite a few acronyms today. And they will use the APIs to access bank accounts and then push payments with the user's permission to merchants, retailers, etc. And that could bring quite a big impact to the card networks and the way that we make payments when we go shopping online. And the second main third parties will be account information service providers. They won't be moving money, but they will be given access to payment information, transactional data, in order to make recommendations, to study credit history, to look at spending patterns, and provide useful services back to consumers who, again, give their consent for that. So the point I think about AISPS is that at the moment we think about companies like Money Supermarket who are already providing comparison services, and we think about how they might be able to do that better. But actually, these services could be retailers themselves, or utilities, or even banks that provide these kinds of services. It's really down to the imagination of those companies. So, as I keep implying through this, it's important that, given that we have new kinds of intermediaries that are doing important things for us, we need authentication in order to prove that we are who we say we are, and that the intermediaries carrying out those activities on our behalf are who they say they are. And so that's why, as part of the legislation, the EC has recommended strong consumer authentication. Now, obviously, here in the mobile space, we're already aware of this. It's a very important part of what a lot of the messaging community in particular already provide, those kinds of services. So today's discussion, we're going to look more closely at that side of the legislation, and in order to do so, I'm joined by Rob Malcolm, who's VP and Marketing of Online Sales at CLX, and also Andrew Budd, who's founder and CEO of iProov. So, as Rima said, you're free to pitch in with any questions and using the chat box, and I'll be looking at those throughout the session. So before we do that, I'm going to have a quick chat with the two guys, and then we're going to have a more general conversation. So first of all, I'll come to you, Andrew, because your face is biggest in my screen at the moment. Andrew, and now we've switched over to Rob, I think, I'm not sure. But anyway, Andrew, I'm going to ask you first. First of all, maybe you could just tell us, as you understand it, how does the legislation define strong? Well, no, let's before we move on to that, tell us about iProov and what you do and how your technology relates back to PSD2.
So, thank you, Tim. So iProov has been around for nearly 5 years, and our job is to strongly authenticate customers, consumers who are operating remotely, whether from mobile devices or from laptops. That authentication is designed to be extremely simple, but also extremely secure. Mm-hmm. To do strong authentication in a simple way, we use face matching because it's the easiest possible solution. I look at my device, it looks back at me, it doesn't get simpler than that. Every device that we possess, whether a mobile or a computing device, any personal device, has a front-facing camera, so there is no hardware dependency. And thanks to the latest developments in machine learning technology, it works really, really well. As a bonus, the face also happens to be the one biometric which is readily available from passports and other electronic identity documents. Our speciality is not just to accurately authenticate people using their faces, but to determine that those people are real, live, physically present human beings in front of the camera and not images, masks, spoofs, recordings, digitally rendered creations, which today is increasingly becoming the principal threat to any kind of biometric authentication, faces and otherwise. We have to remember, my face is not secret. You don't need to steal it. You just go to LinkedIn to get it. So the principal thing that is necessary when dealing with any biometric, and especially with faces, is to make sure that it's real. There is only one genuine Andrew. You may well be glad of this. There's only one genuine Andrew face attached to the front of my skull and on my shoulders. Everything else is a forgery. So iProov's key intellectual property. We have 10 granted patents worldwide. We have very advanced technology that we alone are capable of doing, is to authenticate people using their faces, and at the same time to convince ourselves and our banking customers that they are real life physical human beings. We use that both for strong customer authentication, that is to authenticate the access of a user to their payment instrument as laid down by PSD2, but also to authenticate a person to their own identity document in order to meet the Know Your Customer requirements laid down in parallel legislation such as the Anti-Money Laundering Directives. We authenticate a user both to their identity document and to their previous self, and therefore for us, PSD2 is an incredibly important step forward.
So just for clarity, the legislation mandates two-factor authentication, and that will be something you have, something you know, something inherent, I believe. So does that mean then that I can bypass a passcode by using biometrics and just sort of sign in with my name and then use biometric? I believe there are 3 kinds of authentication possible.
Correct.
Can I choose which 2? And if so, is one of them biometrics?
So in some cases, you will always have to choose. So somebody will have to choose a minimum of 2 out of 3. Mm-hmm. In many cases, that will obviously be the payment institutions, also known as the banks, and they will decide that maybe it's something that you have, like your mobile phone, and a digital certificate cryptographically stored, and something that you are, that is your face or a biometric. But it might be something you know and something you have, or it might be something you know and something that you are. In many cases also, banks may actually have all 3 of them available and mix and match them depending upon the user device and upon user preference and circumstance.
And the kind of, is there anything in the legislation to say what kind of biometrics are permissible and what kind of checks are they recommend in terms of the validity of that or the strength of that biometric?
So in the formation of, just a word on the regulatory structure. PSD2 is the law. PSD2 is the directive that sets down all the rules on market opening, and PSD2 has been adopted, therefore, into national law. PSD2 kind of just says you need strong customer authentication. Here are 2 or 3 general rules about it. To turn those rules into real regulations, the European Banking Authority, the EBA, generated something called a regulatory technical standard on strong customer authentication. And I'm sure that even now there are people putting the EBA RTS on SCA to music. The RTS, therefore, is the detailed document that lays down exactly what our SCA means and how it should be applied. So the RTS picks up where the PSD2 effectively stops. And so I'll talk about the RTS. A lot of the detail is in the RTS. When the EBA were drafting the RTS, they were quite careful not to lay down any particular technology. You know, they didn't ban elbow authentication or anything like that. But they laid down certain requirements, which were that it should not be read easily. It should not be easy to steal the credential, and it should not be easy to copy or spoof it. Those are the principal requirements that they laid down. They said there should be the quote, a very low probability of an unauthorized party being authenticated as the payer, and there should be a strong software guarantee against unauthorized use of the elements if someone gains access to the device and the software. And after that, they said it's kind of up to you.
Right. Okay, well, we'll come back to the RTS because there's a certain amount of discussion and controversy around those. But before we do that, let's bring in Rob. So, hello, Rob. Rob is in Scotland, where he is snowed into his house and he doesn't have the heating on. So, well done, Rob, joining us.
If I start shaking uncontrollably, you'll know why.
So, Rob, tell us a little bit about CLX and how what you do relates to PSD2 at the moment.
Yeah, so from a CLX standpoint, just a bit of background, we've obviously been in the messaging business primarily for at least the last 10 years. And the messaging business, to some degree, has formed the basis of many of these types of authentication type criteria, particularly around identity and possession. So we've seen our volumes grow significantly over the last 10 years, up to 20 billion SMS last year. And roughly 25% of those are what we would call two-factor authentication codes, one-time passwords, and those kinds of things. So our customers, many of whom are banks, many of whom are payment service providers, and very shortly, many of them will be these account information service providers. They are particularly interested and concerned as to whether or not they could continue to use SMS and voice and a variety of well-used communication mediums to be part of the strong customer authentication requirement in PSD2. In addition to that, CLX, fundamentally is an API company. Everything that we do is available through an API. And so we see our business extending beyond just being a communications provider that enables this the strong customer authentication, but also in working very closely with mobile operators, we hope that they can themselves open up their APIs in order to facilitate strong customer authentication by determining whether or not somebody's SIM card is the same one that it was last time, or determining the location of a particular phone, and a variety of other types of information that could be used to build a risk profile related to a particular payment transaction.
And are you seeing a new business being developed as a result of PSD2 at the moment? Are you seeing your clients require more from you, or new clients getting in touch because of the need to meet this legislation?
So I would say that we see the mobile device, the mobile telephone number, as being something that continues to surprise us, just in terms of how valuable that is becoming, and how many customers are using that to determine, one of these three possible ways of authenticating somebody and proving that they are who they say they are. So I would say that there doesn't seem to be any reduction in demand for that at this point.
Maybe, I don't know if it's possible for you to talk a little bit about the kind of consumer experience of this kind of authentication when it comes to these new payment services. So let's say I am on a merchant site and I want to buy something from them, and instead of putting in my card details, they offer me the opportunity to just push them a payment from my bank account through an intermediary. Could you? I don't know if you're actually doing this yet, or if it's just too new. But either way, could you kind of give us an idea of how the authentication piece might play out in that scenario?
Well, obviously, as part of PSD2, the fundamental thing is that the card issuer or the bank, the issuing bank, needs to authenticate that payment in some way, shape, or form. And so, fundamentally, one of the three that we've discussed, knowledge, possession, or inherence, is still required in order to facilitate that payment transfer. So, I don't know, Andrew, if you've come across the scenario of a merchant basically working with a third party to facilitate that.
So the typical user experience is that a payment panel will be presented on the device by a payment service. So the merchant will find themselves with a payment panel presented, probably but not necessarily by the bank. And the user will then be invited to authenticate themselves using whatever two of the three methods are required. Once that happens, behind the scenes, that authentication is then turned into authentication code, which is then passed to a chain of intermediaries to the merchant's payment organization, such that the payment can be extracted. the really interesting thing about the user journey is how simple and easy can this be made, because a lot of the anxiety around PSD2 was all about the disruption in the user experience that might be required as a result of having continuously to use historic methods of authentication. I mean, obviously, we have the enormously successful Bank ID in Scandinavia, where you have a hard or a soft authentication code generator, and you have to get your code generator out and read the number off and type it into the panel. And if you have to do that every time you want to pay 10 krona, that's not so very funny. So there was a good deal of anxiety, and a lot of the work around PSD2 has been about simplifying the customer journey. There are two added complications in all of this. One of them is the fact that the EBA-RTS says that whatever two methods you use have got to be substantially independent of each other. And that's really quite significant. I'm sure we'll talk about that in a minute. And the other is that they say that the channel used to do the authentication has to be separate from the channel used to make the purchase. Well, exactly what this means is it will be subject to some interpretation. But generally speaking, it's been understood that if you're trying to buy something on your laptop, you're going to have to authenticate on your mobile, and maybe vice versa. Now, there are some degrees of freedom in that, but the issue of the customer journey is terribly important. People are obviously, and that's, I think, going to be where a lot of focus of effort is going to be.
So, obviously, that begs the question. I mean, I thought you were going to answer it yourself, but you've left the gap for me to ask it, which is, so, okay, I'm buying on my laptop. I need to authenticate. It needs to be on a different kind of device. I get a text from CLX. Or an iProov flow, and that's all understood. If I'm buying from my phone, my text comes through on my phone. Does that then nullify? Does that contravene the legislation, or has that not yet been resolved?
Well, so there's a core central issue about the role of the mobile device in PSD2. Because all of the methods pretty much all of the methods that are being discussed, including, for example, the sending of a text message, ultimately come down to the question of possession of the device. If someone can send a text message to my phone, that means it's arrived on my phone, it's on my phone, it's my device. So there are an enormous number of different technological solutions that confirm possession of the device. What's much harder is to find methods that genuinely test either biometric inherence or knowledge, which don't in some way depend upon ownership of the device, or aren't in some way impacted by the device.
Right.
So then the question is, well, can you segregate channels? Can you segregate independence on the same mobile device? And the answer is yes. The PSD2 paper, the PSD2 the RTS wording says that providing you've got two genuinely and segregated and independent applications on the same device, then they can be considered as separate channels. So obviously the text message has its own application, and the web browser has its application. And providing the two of them don't leak, then they're independent. I think it becomes a much harder sell when you come down. So those are the two channels. It becomes a much harder sell when you start saying, well, I'm using two factors of authentication which actually depend upon ownership, which actually entirely depend upon the integrity of the device, but we're going to pretend they're not. And that's actually where we come in.
Okay, and just to sort of continue on that theme, which is a topic I know that you're going to have a strong opinion on, is obviously people are getting more used to biometrics on phones, first of all with the touch ID, and now with facial ID. What does the law have to say about whether facial ID is done on the device or on the cloud?
So there was a bit of a fight about this when the RTS was constructed. And there were really two camps in the authentication world today. There are those, and as you would expect, the mobile device vendors are in this camp, who would like everything to be done on the device for various reasons. And then there were those, such as ourselves, who say that this is in security terms quite reckless and actually produces a series of noxious results. And actually the authentication must be done in servers with no security processes or dependencies on the device at all. So you've got the device side people and the server side people. So when we authenticate a person's face, we transmit a very short video of their face back to our servers, and we do all the authentication processes on the server. So it doesn't matter how corrupted the software on the device is. It doesn't matter whether it's been subject to malware or takeover or anything like that. All the security processing is done in our servers. And in addition, anytime someone tries to experiment with different attacks on our systems, because everything's being analyzed in the servers, we see that and can detect and analyze it. Whereas when things are being done on the device, ultimately what you're doing is, we would sustain that biometrics on the device is just another way of detecting device ownership. And in addition, it also represents an unlimited, unsurveyed laboratory for attackers to just go away and play with the biometric system until they've broken it. Usually it takes about 1 or 2 days. Samsung S8 iris recognizer, I think, was broken in 3 days. Face ID, I think, took a whole week to be broken. And that's the vulnerability of systems that run entirely on the device. And those of us who are in the server business point out that biometric authentication running on the device is effectively not much more than a test of ownership of the device. Now, the RTS formed a compromise in this area, and it said, yes, you are allowed to consider biometric or other forms of authentication that take place on the device as being completely separate from some other device-based system, providing a number of tests are met, which are worded in a slightly strange way, and I think will give technologists and lawyers lots of joy. They basically say 3 basic things have to be met. You have to have a separated secure execution environment, which nobody quite knows what it means. Mechanisms to ensure the software device is not being altered by the payer or by a third party, which is also an interesting thing, because the device has been altered. The people who alter it can help to ensure that you don't know that it's been altered. And also, when alterations have taken place, mechanisms to mitigate the consequences thereof. Those things are in Article 9 of the RTS. And quite what the boundaries of that are, I think, will give vendors and regulators hours of harmless fun.
Right.
We would say the simpler solution is just get one of the 2 factors off the device altogether, and then you don't have all these problems.
Okay, well, let's hope the lawyers have lots of work to do. We all want lawyers to stay as richly remunerated as they already are. Rob, so if I can bring you back in, because obviously Andrew has just talked about the fact, the sort of intricacies of the argument around who owns the device, and is that enough to prove identity and so on. So another kind of angle on all this argument is the SIM swap angle, whereby in this PSD2 scenario, I might be signing in or approving a transaction, but actually there's been a SIM swap in the background. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that problem and how that might be addressed.
Sure. So obviously, SIM swap is something that's been in the news media quite a lot, unfortunately, in the last 12 to 24 months. And just for those people on the call who aren't familiar with that type of fraud, it's essentially a form of social engineering where somebody can go and impersonate you as a mobile phone subscriber in a store or over the phone, and convince a mobile operator typically to cancel your SIM card and send a new one to potentially a fraudster. The fraudster would then leverage that SIM card, put it into a device, and at the same time hack into your email and then intercept the PIN code or the one-time password in order to get into an account, for example. And so this is not unlike many other forms of social engineering, where somebody would call you and pretend to be your bank and try and get some information that only you know in order to do the same thing. But what's particularly concerning is obviously that if somebody does compromise your SIM card, it's very difficult to know. The only way that you can know is that the signal on your phone will effectively disappear, and you'll just not get any phone calls or texts, and it's really up to you to determine that has happened. So having said that, I would say that it's important to remember that the fraudster typically still has to basically do two things. They have to know something that only you know, which is usually a password of some kind, and then they have to intercept the SMS or whatever it is. It could be a voice call by swapping out your SIM. So it's not a trivial fraud. It requires a fair bit of understanding of who you are, and it's not something that can typically be done en masse. It's usually a very targeted type of fraud. So there's obviously two very rational solutions to try and reduce that type of fraud. The first one, which is the most obvious, is for mobile operators, banks, financial institutions. Many of them already do this very well. But to try and limit this form of social engineering where somebody can impersonate who you are. That's the obvious one. But there's technological enhancements that have happened over the last 12 months. Many of the UK operators and the Irish mobile operators have started to offer APIs to trusted third parties who can essentially determine whether or not your SIM card has changed in the last 48 hours. And that can be a very important additional factor that a bank or a financial institution, a payment service provider could use in order to determine whether or not something strange might be going on. Similarly, some mobile operators are offering an API that allows to determine whether or not there's been a redirect rule turned on for your telephone number, which again could indicate that somebody has tried to compromise your device and redirect a phone call to somebody else. So we see these types of additional APIs as being increasingly important to pretty much anybody who is interested in security to add additional information and additional checks in order to determine whether or not some kind of fraud might be taking place.
So that's one kind of fraud. I don't know if you're able to talk about the other kind of fraud, which is rather than the individual being identity being hijacked, the individual being kind of phished by a third party, a bogus third party that says, we're processing payments for Amazon, give us your bank details and we will, you'll be able to push your payments to them, and rather than use a card network. So basically bogus intermediaries. Do you see that as being an issue?
I think, I mean, wherever there's money involved, I think that fraud is likely to follow. I think that PSD2 has done a relatively good job at ensuring that the ways in which third-party intermediaries would be interacting with financial institutions is secure, and I think I've also done a reasonably good job at explaining as to how the consumer needs to opt in a way that is very difficult to spoof. So. To try and predict how much fraud would happen, I think it's difficult to say. It's very early days. There's likely to be some, but I think that the framework for how it should be done is so far sufficient. I don't know, Andrew, if you have any thoughts on that.
I think there is a real issue which will continue unabated with PSD2, associated with credentials that can be shared in a human way. Or either so that a password or a one-time PIN number, which somebody can be asked for, and therefore which I can share willingly with you. Any credential which I can willingly share with you, particularly remotely, is going to be vulnerable to particular forms of phishing. The other threat that I think one has to be aware of is the bogus application, which shims, which either replaces or shims the real PSP application, gathers the credential from the user or the permission from the user, and then redirects it off towards the fraudster. This is obviously a vulnerability with any kind of one-time passcode, not just SMS. If you type your passcode into a shim, into a bogus website, and that shim sends it off to a hacker, the hacker now has that. That was actually one of the concerns why we built iProov, because we wanted to build a system which would not be vulnerable to that kind of attack. And there are various ways in which that's been solved. I think there's quite a lot of work going on now on the creation of cryptographic credentials, which are stored on the device itself, and which provide a very strong end-to-end authentication of the device, so that the bank interrogates this cryptographic credential, which is stored potentially in a trusted execution environment, and they have a quiet chat with each other, which cannot be intermediated and certainly cannot be shared by the user, because the user doesn't know anything about it. But again, that's quite sophisticated. It requires applications to be installed. There's some setup issues associated with it. So it's not going to be available in all cases, but it's a pretty good way of getting one of the two factors in place.
Andrew, do you know when? I mean, you hinted earlier about some of the exceptions and the limitations about when authentication is needed. So maybe you could explain a little bit more about that in terms of where these exemptions are, and also, will there be a different kind of authentication required when you're making a payment to when you're just accessing data?
So it's quite complicated. I'll try and summarize. Firstly, premium mobile payments,
yeah,
a business that I think all three of us on this call know well, have continued the tradition set down about 12 years ago in the e-money directive, and are actually exempted, providing that the transactions themselves are less than 30 euros and that no more than 300 euros per month are transmitted to a particular device. Now, that doesn't mean exempted from strong customer authentication. I mean exempted from all of PSD2.
Right.
So the interesting thing is the old premium rate business, the premium rate business is to a substantial extent exempted. It of course has its own challenges. In fact, it was some massive frauds in the premium rate business that gave rise to the creation of iProov. So the premium rate business, mobile digital content billed through the phone bill is to a substantial extent exempted. Pure account lookup, pure access to accounts is in general terms not subject to strong customer authentication, provided you can't do anything. Low value payments, including contactless payments, are exempted. And then there was some very hotly fought over exemptions based upon the way in which risk in the transaction is assessed and measured by methods including behavioural, but not just behavioural methods, that give rise to some exemptions. But if you get if you get your risk assessment wrong and your fraud rates shoot up, then those exemptions will be withdrawn, and you'll kind of have to get off the naughty step again. So
given that phone-based commerce is exempt from all of PSD2 within the limits that you just said, do you think that's an opportunity for the business? Because frictionless commerce always, everybody wants better checkout rates and better payment completion rates. And if you suddenly have frictionless commerce for a certain kind of transaction, which is a mobile-based transaction, is that a big opportunity for the market, you think?
Look, mobile payments were hugely successful in the decades that passed, precisely because of its frictionlessness. I mean, there wasn't much else going for it. Payout rates were quite different from the payout rates from standard payment mechanisms. The VAT treatment was often a bit of a mess. The fraud rates went bananas at various times. The interfaces and the APIs were historically absolutely horrible. The reconciliation, I could go on. So, but the key thing was you could buy something with 1 or 2 clicks, or just by sending an SMS, and it was that frictionlessness that made it very successful. I think there will be limits on what payments can be used for. The Article 3 of the PSD2 talks about the fact that it's going to be for digital content. There are these spend limits on it. There are some interesting legal get-outs on there as well. But I think what will actually happen is that the vast mass of the fintech industry will work over the next few years to find equally frictionless ways of doing strong customer authentication. That will have the big advantage that there will not risk the kind of fraud explosions some of us lived through and were so very unpleasant in the mobile payments area. So I think a lot of energy will go from September 2019, when the RTS on strong customer authentication actually comes into force. Because although it's worth saying that although PSD2 came into force last week, the strong customer authentication RTS actually only takes force in September 2019. So we've got this weird interim period over the next year and a half. Right. I think in the time leading up to September 2019, there's going to be a lot of work done to try and make RTS strong customer authentication as smooth, as frictionless, as low effort as it's possible to be.
Just a couple of questions through. So I'm going to ask Rob about dynamic linking. Someone's reminded me that authentication has to be dynamically linked to the payment. Could you just explain what that means?
Yeah, so my understanding is that dynamic linking is not always required. The scenario where it becomes very helpful is, let's say, for example, you log into your favorite retail clothes store online, and you've already given them something that you possess. Let's say, for example, your card number. The dynamic linking is designed to essentially authorize the payment as opposed to necessarily authenticate who you are. So they could send you an email, they could send you an SMS or any type of message for that matter with a one-time code. And the important thing is that in the message that they send you, they have to basically give you the name of the recipient of the money. They have to give you the amount. And if either of those changes, then clearly that code cannot be valid anymore. And so the important part of dynamic linking is really to ensure that that code is only valid for one transaction. And even if that dynamic link is intercepted in some way, it cannot be used for anything else. And so it's simply a way of authorizing a payment in scenarios where you may have already given a trusted merchant something that authenticates who you are, or you've already authenticated yourself via other means. It could be a password or whatever it is, and they just want you to authorize a payment.
Right. And another question we've had is asking about whether...
Tim, could I just say, there's one little flaw in the dynamic linking regulations in the RTS, and that is that it insists that the dynamic linking token should include the bank identity, the amount, and the account number. But what it doesn't need to do is to contain the payment reference. And there are quite a number of different circumstances under which the actual destination or a specific aspect of the transaction is actually not in the payee details at all, but it's actually hidden away in the reference. And the reference doesn't have to be part of the dynamic link. So there's actually a bit of the people have identified a bit of a weakness there, which we'll see how that gets worked out.
We have another question which is asking, is the call direct/forward detection for both, is this for both voice calls and SMS or just voice?
So the only APIs that I'm aware of today are specifically for voice. I'm not entirely sure whether or not it's a standard feature, on a mobile operator's network today in order to be able to forward an SMS. But I imagine that that if that became something that fraudsters were using to try and intercept. That a mobile operator in theory could develop an API to detect that as well, and enable a bank to know whether or not an SMS is being rejected. And clearly, sorry to interrupt you, Tim, but clearly, the limits of these types of detections are to some degree determined by the security of the operating system, because if there is some malware on the device, all kinds of crazy things can happen that unfortunately a network provider may not be able to detect. So, much of what we might hear to some degree requires that your device is secure. And therein lies a problem in itself in certain scenarios.
I know that I should ask you about RCS because it's something that CLX is very keen to talk about at the moment, because I know you're one of Google's partners on this. And one of the wider ramifications of PSD2 possibly is moving payments to new environments. So the one that everyone talks about is you're in a chat session, you can talk to a retail bot in your chat session, and then you don't have to go anywhere to make a payment. So I wonder if the sort of payment experience and the authentication experience inside an RCS session is something that you've got any opinions about?
I mean, I think it's a very exciting area. I think that RCS is obviously one channel where payments become a natural kind of experience. For example, you're talking to your airline and you're trying to change your seat using a chatbot on RCS, for example, and the airline says, sure, we could give you an exit seat, but it's going to cost you 30 euros. Being able to authorize and authenticate yourself in that session to pay that 30 euros without necessarily whipping out your credit card or doing something like that is obviously very attractive. But equally, it could be any chat session. It could be Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp chat session. And like Andrew said, I think that there's going to be quite a large amount of innovation. I mean, we've already seen verified by Visa, and Visa announcing that they're going to start doing quite complex risk algorithms to determine whether or not transactions are fraudulent. I think that kind of innovation is really going to be required in order to make those in-message payments extremely seamless while still complying with PSD2.
And Andrew, on in a related area, it's not hard to imagine moving from message and chat-based payments to voice-based payments. And we already see examples, in the banking space of people voice-enabling bots so that you can just talk to your app and ask them about your balance, etc. So again, it's a hypothetical question, but if we get to the point where we're buying things through Alexa or we're talking to our phones to buy things, how might the authentication piece fit into that? It would be a bit weird to say, I want to buy this product from Amazon and then have to get a text code. And, how do you think that might play out?
Well, I think, what I don't think will happen is that voice authentication will persist as a viable means in the market.
Right.
Voice authentication is becoming rapidly widely used in call centers, and it's making everyone's lives a lot simpler, particularly for the kind of KYC, get past the identification thing. The problem is that the advent of high quality voice changes is now so rapid that it becomes extremely easy to spoof somebody else's voice, to the extent that you will not be able to rely upon the voice print of the person speaking as any kind of authentication method. It's just, there's too little information in voice to actually provide the richness that you need in order to detect forgeries. So the answer is, I think that will happen actually. I mean, I think you will need I think it's quite likely that even when you're buying things through Alexa, you will need some other object with you, potentially your mobile device, which will become a channel for the communication for that strong customer authentication to take place. And the challenge will be how to make that as simple as possible. Of course, if Alexa has a screen and a camera, then you'll be able to do remote face authentication. The whole problem goes away completely.
Yeah, and I think just to emphasize that, where we were fundamentally going is that, Andrew, although I 100% agree with you that voice is not a great way of authenticating somebody, it becomes one aspect of potentially many, many, many things that ultimately determine a risk profile for a certain transaction. So, for example, if you are talking to Alexa, it could end up taking your IP address. It could be taking, various other types of information. When last you basically spoke to Alexa, what you said to Alexa, all kinds of information potentially. But I agree with Andrew. I don't see any other way of having something you have in addition to that conversation.
One of the challenges that I see is that there are a large number of methods of both strong customer authentication and risk assessment, which are good at capturing incompetent fraudsters. That is, they are ways in which, if the fraudster is not very clever, he'll fall over it, but are easily spoofed by the clever fraudster. And I think we have a history of underestimating the intelligence and the motivation of people driven by compelling criminal business models into thinking that if we have a bundle of easy to break things, then together they will give us defense. And the answer is, I don't think that's true. I think we are moving into a world in which the economic benefits of mounting successful attacks on a large scale are so big that we cannot assume that we're dealing with idiots. So location is extremely easy to spoof, device signature is extremely easy to spoof, voice is extremely easy to spoof. You say, well, put the three of them together and you make yourself so secure. I don't think the answer that's true, because actually you put three easy to spoof things together and you've got something that's easy to spoof. That's not today where people's risk assessments are, but I think that's where we're going to be. Okay,
well, we've come to the end of our session. We've done 55 minutes on authentication alone, which gives you an indication of how rich this topic is for debate. And I think that we at the MEF very much plan to come back and talk about some of the wider implications for banking, personal finance, and so on at another date. So I want to thank everybody for listening in. I believe a recording will be available, so watch out on the website for that. And I'm going to hand you back to Rima to close the session. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Tim, Andrew, and Rob, for a really great and informative session. Thanks again to CLX Communications for also supporting our MEF Connect series. We hope you found the session as useful as I did. All attendees are able to download the MEF PSD2 guide as a thank you for attending. And please look out for analysis and a recording of the session on the MEF blog. The monthly session takes place, the next one in February, just at the beginning. And the next topic is on the future of entertainment in Africa. And we look forward to having you join us. So thanks again, and see you then.